Hello, I'm Natalie Zett, and welcome to Flower in the River. This podcast, inspired by my book of the same name, explores the 1915 Eastland disaster in Chicago and its enduring impact, particularly on my family's history. We'll explore the intertwining narratives of others impacted by this tragedy as well, and we'll dive into writing and genealogy and uncover the surprising supernatural elements that surface in family history research. Come along with me on this journey of discovery. Hi, this is Natalie, and welcome to episode 112 of Flower in the River. I hope you're doing well. And speaking of podcasts, before we get started, I want to say congratulations to the one, the only Krista Cowan. She just celebrated a year of doing her wonderful podcast, Stories That Live in Us. And I am humbled, honored, and still in a state of shock that she interviewed me for this podcast. But it's brought nothing but goodness to my life. And I always wish the best for somebody like Krista because she is incredible. So here's some good news. To my delight and surprise, I heard from two people this week who have family connections to the Eastland disaster. One of these folks heard me cover their family member's story and asked for additional information about them, and I was happy to accommodate that request. And the other person asked if I could help find information about their family member. This is someone that I have never profiled, but I plan to do so because, ironically, they fit into the deeper research that I'm doing about the Polish communities in Chicago who were affected by the Eastland disaster. And I was so gratified to be able to locate information about their person and share that with them. Way back when I started doing this podcast, one of the things I hoped it would do is reach other family members of the Eastland people. So this really was a dream come true. And it meant so much to me that I was actually able to locate and share additional information with these people about their loved ones. It's kind of like I wanted to be for these people the person that I wish could have been there for me when I began this journey. However, sometimes you have to be your own Henry Louis Gates, right? I mean, that's a high bar, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, so I have to say, honestly, there's nothing more disheartening than looking for information about a family member, finding their name and finding nothing more than a name and maybe some dates. And with the information that is available about these people, I have learned that the information is out there. You do have to do some research, but it is definitely there. And I'm here to fill in those gaps. If you are a family member of someone who was affected by the Eastland disaster, reach out to me. I'll do the best I can to find out more information for you. You know how to get a hold of me, but if you don't, just go to my website, go under the contact information, and you can sign up for the newsletter. I've got my email there. I'm pretty contactable. Is that a word? Well, regardless, it is now. So please don't hesitate. If you do contact me, give me as much information about your Eastland person as possible, and I will do my best to locate them. Of course, I can't make any guarantees, but so far, with a little bit of searching, I've been able to locate people. And also, as you're going to hear in this episode, I found a whole new group of people who have never been profiled anywhere other than in the original articles where they were featured. So there's yet more to discover about the Eastland disaster. I don't think we'll ever be able to do all of it, but there's a lot more out there than what you may have been led to believe. So don't give up, reach out, and we'll do something. So for the last few weeks in this podcast, we have gone across the pond a few times. I mean, I'm based in the United States, but this time we're going to stay stateside for this story. And again, this is one of those stories that has not been told as far as I can tell. And it's a really important story because it's an entirely different perspective on the Eastland, the ship, as well as the Eastland disaster. We're going to talk about Benton Harbor, Michigan. It's the kind of place that you might drive past on your way to somewhere else, but slow down just a beat, and you might find a lakeside town with a history that deserves more than just a passing glance. Nestled where the St. Joseph and Paw Paw rivers meet Lake Michigan on the western side of Michigan, Benton Harbor did not start out as a shipping hub. It began with orchards. That's right, rows and rows of fruit trees tended by farmers in the 1830s. But as lush as the land was, there was a problem. How do you get all that fruit to market? That's where visionaries like Stern Brunson, Charles Hull, and Henry Morton came in. They carved a mile-long canal through the marshland to connect their little settlement directly to big old Lake Michigan. By 1860, that canal turned a patch of fruit farms into a working harbor. The town, briefly called Brunson Harbor, soon became Benton Harbor, and it was open for business. By the 1870s, Benton Harbor was booming. Ships came and went with staggering amounts of produce. Peaches, apples, grapes, you name it. Basket factories and sawmills popped up along the canal. If it could be packed, shipped, or sold, it probably passed through this port. But this wasn't just a working town. It was also a place that people visited. It was a tourist kind of place. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, passenger steamers from Chicago regularly docked there, carrying vacationers hungry for fresh air, lake breezes, and a break from city life. Ships like the city of Benton Harbor and the Theodore Roosevelt made this town a leisure destination. Oh yeah, the Eastland was one of those steamers that frequented Benton Harbor. And I'm going to read the article from just 13 months prior to the Eastland disaster. This is from the Monday, June 15th, 1914 issue of the News Palladium in Benton Harbor. And if the Eastland were a person, this gives you an idea of who this person was before the disaster. As we've heard on this podcast, the Eastland has a sketchy history at best, but for the people in Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, the Eastland, well, it looked different. It was part of their pride and joy. The headline is, Puritan Beats Time of Steamer Eastland in Fast Lake Race. Some of the print is hard to read, but I'll do the best I can here, okay? G&M liner beats rival excursion steamer by 3 minutes. Patrons of the two Twin Cities steamship lines were treated to more than bargain for Sunday afternoon when, in making the run across from Chicago, the Graham and Morton steamer, Puritan, and the St. Joseph Steamship Company's new liner, Eastland, felt the thrill of adventure and engaged in an exciting big ship race that brought new glory to the water-going honors of the Puritan, which beat the time set by the Eastland by about 3 minutes. The boats were timed as they passed the end piers at Chicago, the Eastland clearing at 10:08 and the Puritan at 10:16, giving the St. Joe liner an 8-minute start. The engines of the G&M steamer were in the finest trim, and the Puritan gained 3 minutes on her rival on the trip across. The Eastland entering the St. Joseph piers at 1:34, and the Puritan entering at 1:39, 5 minutes after, thus cutting down the Eastland's 8-minute start to 5 minutes or a 3-minute lead. The Eastland had considerable difficulty in docking, and the Puritan reached the central docks and was unloading passengers before the Eastland succeeded in tying up. On the trip going back, the Puritan again outspeeded the Eastland by a minute, passing the St. Joseph steamer at the Chicago piers and docking a minute ahead. A crowd of interested bystanders were gathered along the bluffs at St. Joseph Sunday afternoon as the two boats headed in, as it had become a quite prevailing rumor that the two steamers would try for supremacy. So that's the end of that article about the Eastland, the earlier years. While Benton Harbor wasn't the Eastland's destination that day, there is actually an even deeper connection between this lakeside town and the ship, as well as the disaster. And that connection runs right through its sister city, St. Joseph. So Benton Harbor and St. Joseph are often called the twin cities of southwestern Michigan, probably to differentiate it from the twin cities of Minnesota. That would be Minneapolis, St. Paul, which I know fairly well. But these two twin cities are separated by the St. Joseph River and are closely tied by history, economy, and culture. And it just so happens that the St. Joseph Steamship Company, based in St. Joseph, Michigan, owned the Eastland at the time of the tragedy. The company had purchased the Eastland around July 1st, 1914, with the goal of running excursions between St. Joseph and Chicago. Again, this was a popular route back then for tourists, merchants, and anyone craving a lake breeze and a break from the big city. But if you've been listening to this podcast or know anything about the Eastland, it had always been a troubled ship. It had a reputation for being unstable. And then on that July morning in 1915, that instability turned deadly. While preparing to carry Western Electric employees to a picnic in Michigan City, Indiana, well, you know the ship capsized right there at the dock in Chicago, killing over 800. The Eastland disaster is rightfully remembered as a Chicago story, and yet the ship's ownership by a St. Joseph, Michigan company created ripple effects that reached across the river into Benton Harbor. Those were shared communities, connected not only by geography and shipping lines, but also by the lives and the stories and the losses tied to the Eastland. And 50 years after the Eastland disaster in 1965, those connections surfaced again when local journalists interviewed Eastland survivors and witnesses and others who had quietly built lives in Benton Harbor, but were connected to the Eastland, the ship, and the Eastland disaster. And by the way, I want to mention that George W. Hilton's definitive book on the Eastland disaster includes an entire chapter devoted to the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. So that gives valuable insight into how these twin cities were woven into the broader narrative of Great Lakes shipping and tragedy. So now that we've set the stage, let's get into the actual stories of the Benton Harbor residents who lived through the Eastland disaster. Let's hear what they thought about it. These names and their stories don't appear in any of the Eastland books or on major websites devoted to the Eastland, as far as I can tell. These stories add another viewpoint, another layer, and another perspective to the history of the Eastland disaster. And I also want to give you a heads up. Some of these memories are very graphic. They were shared by these survivors and witnesses who lived through unimaginable things. And some of the details may be hard to hear, so please take care of yourself. You can listen next week if this gets to be too much, but I would encourage you, if you can, to listen to what these people saw and what they lived with. And I believe, as always, in letting the people speak for themselves, letting the departed speak on their own behalf. Thank you. This article is from the July 30th, 1965 issue of the News Palladium in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Headline: Story of Eastland Tragedy Jogs Old Memories. Union Pier woman was survivor of disaster. Quote, bodies were stacked in plain boxes. This was by Ben Nottingham. Stories and pictures of the Eastland catastrophe in last Saturday's News Palladium stirred many memories in southwestern Michigan. Among those who recalled the worst disaster in Great Lakes history were Mrs. Olive Divis of Union Pier, Mrs. Lucille Bartz, Mrs. Louise Schneck, her mother, and Miss Catherine Gross of Benton Harbor. Mrs. Divis estimates she was in the water nearly 45 minutes after the Eastland excursion boat turned on its side and sank in the Chicago River the morning of July 24, 1915. It just went over. Quote, just as I got on deck, she says, it seemed everyone went over to the rail opposite the dock to look at the river. It just gave a lurch and went over. It's almost beyond reason that such a big thing should just roll over like a toy. I could swim, and I was in the water about 45 minutes before firemen pulled me out, end quote. Only 21 at the time, she was one of the Western Electric Company employees for whom the boat had been chartered by the company for an excursion to Michigan City. Mrs. Divis says the tragedy nearly wiped out her department. Mrs. Bartz of 273 Parker Avenue, Benton Harbor, would have gone to Chicago that morning on the Eastland if it had been on its usual schedule. Instead, the ill-fated steamer had stayed in Chicago to make the charter trip, and 812 persons perished. Dockside morgues. She, her mother, sister, and brother took a train to Chicago, where they went to the scene with an uncle who was an undertaker. Her uncle handled almost 200 bodies from the wreck within a short time. Bodies were stacked up in plain board boxes, Mrs. Bartz remembers. The steamer was still on its side in the river, and they were taking bodies to nearby buildings, which had been converted into temporary morgues. Miss Gross, a retired schoolteacher living at 1165 Colfax Avenue, Benton Harbor, recalls how Marlon Collins survived the disaster only to become the first area man to die in World War I. Memorial marker. A past president of the Benton Harbor Federation of Women's Club and still a trustee, she says the Federation put up a fountain where Colfax then ended at Main Street as a memorial to Collins. The fountain was taken down when Colfax was extended past Main and a marker left on the site. Later, Collins' name was included on a marble block monument in front of the Benton Harbor City Hall, where it may still be seen today. That's the end of this article. The next article is a continuation of this article, and this one is also from the July 24th, 1965 issue of the News Palladium, Benton Harbor, Michigan. Headline, and some here can remember it well. Victims grabbed at the swimmers. Then they all went down, Benton Harbor man recalls. Editor's note, widely known in the Twin Cities area, that would be Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, Robert L. Sturkin was one of those who witnessed the Eastland disaster in Chicago 50 years ago. He moved here 5 years after the catastrophe and is currently an employee of Benton Harbor Screw Machine Company and secretary of the St. Joseph Elks Club. He lives in Benton Harbor with his wife, Genevieve. This is by Ben Nottingham. Quote, I remember they took one woman out of there that had a youngster under each arm. They were all dead. I think they had to break the woman's arms to separate the bodies. There were lifebuoys along there, and we threw one out, but so many grabbed it, they all went under. There were a few good swimmers, but they couldn't save anyone. They didn't have a chance. Everyone would grab him and they'd all go down, end quote. The worst disaster in Great Lakes history happened in Chicago 50 years ago. It took the lives of 812 persons within a few minutes as thousands of horrified bystanders looked on. The number of dead would wipe out the present village of Stevensville. One witness. Robert Sturkin, 245 Cyrils Avenue, Benton Harbor, was one of those who watched as more than 800 persons died when the steamer Eastland capsized in the Chicago River. He was working in the Reed Building on the north side of the river when the disaster occurred. The Eastland was moored on the opposite side of the river, taking on passengers near the foot of Clark Street. A planing mill employee, he had worked all night helping remodel the Reed Murdoch offices and just stepped out on a balcony above the river for a breath of fresh air. The passage of a half-century has dimmed certain memories, but others are still sharp and clear. He remembers the woman with a child under each arm and the stiffness of all three bodies when they were taken out of the steamer through a hole cut in the side of the steel hull, the knots of people who went under, all clutching at the futile straw of a small floating object. Quote, there was a lot of current in the water that morning, and it swept a lot of these people away, Sturkin recalls. People were clustered like seagulls on the piling downstream. They were drowning and grabbing anything within reach, like a drowning man will. It happened so fast, most of them never realized what was going on until it was too late. There were a lot of small craft on the river, but they couldn't do much. There were just too many people, end quote. Becomes morgue. A modest man who shuns having his picture taken, he helped in rescue operations and with the removal of bodies, but will say little about his part in them. He estimates that between 200 and 300 bodies were placed in the Reed Murdoch shipping room and warehouse, which was turned into a temporary morgue. Many buildings in the area became morgues that Saturday. The Eastland was captained by Harris Pedersen, then 57 of Benton Harbor. Delwyn Fisner of St. Joseph was first officer of the 265-foot steamer, and Peter Fisher of Benton Harbor was third officer. Quote, it all happened in 2 minutes, Captain Pedersen said later. He said the cause of the catastrophe was a mystery. $2,000 on board. First estimates of the loss placed the death toll as high as 1,500. There were over 2,000 passengers, including men, women, and children, on board when the craft overturned at her dock. A Chicago deputy coroner said 60% of the passengers were women. Many of the dead removed through holes cut in the hull showed evidence of a desperate struggle for life, their faces battered, clothing ripped, and fingernails torn. George Munger of Benton Harbor, purser of the Eastland, swam ashore after a narrow escape. The captain, first and second officers also escaped. Owned by the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Line, the Eastland was one of 5 boats chartered by the Western Electric Company to take employees on a picnic to Michigan City, Indiana. Holiday ends. The holiday atmosphere turned to terror and panic when the ship listed suddenly away from the dock and then broke her hawsers and then rolled over onto her side toward the dock and drifted out into the river. Later reports said water ballast tanks on the Eastland were being pumped out so the cruise ship could hold more passengers as picnickers crowded aboard. Certain officials claimed too many crowded aboard too fast, and the ship was thrown out of balance. Survivors and witnesses of the disaster never forgot the scene. One who still remembers is Robert Sturken. That's the end of the article about Robert Sturken. Headline: She was jaunty, leaving St. Joe. Goodbye, everybody. Her merry final time. Editor's note: living out the sunset years of his life on his Meadow Mist farm near Hartford, Robert L. Brandt will never forget the Eastland tragedy, which took the lives of 812 men, women, and children when the Eastland tipped over at her dock in the Chicago River. In the following letter to the News Palladium, this widely known fruit and flower grower pens a thrilling story of this great tragedy in Great Lakes history. As a boy of 19, Mr. Brandt was an employee in the St. Joseph office of the company that owned the Eastland. Unknowingly, he watched the Eastland head out of the St. Joseph harbor and head toward Chicago and the setting sun in the west. Less than 24 hours later, this fastest and sleekest Great Lakes excursion steamer came to her ill-fated end in murky waters of the river. This article is by Robert L. Brandt, Sr. How well I remember the 24th day of July 50 years ago. It came on a Friday, and it was a little after 6 p.m. as I walked up the incline built up the bluff opposite the old Whitcomb Hotel. Halfway up the steep old ramp that Chicagoans had climbed by the thousands over the years, there was a platform at its turn with seats where you might rest and catch your breath, or lean over the railing and view the beautiful scene that unfolded below you. I was 19 years old and full of hope that my future life might be bright, for I had just completed my work for the day in the offices of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, operators of the sleek twin-screw recreation ship, the Eastland. She was a masterpiece of the shipbuilder's art and faster than a greyhound. Her crew boasted a record time of 3 hours flat from the Chicago breakwater to the lighthouse at Old St. Joe. She was built high and narrow, perhaps 300 feet long, entirely of steel, but she rolled and tossed in a high wind or heavy sea. She cut the water with such ease that they reversed her engines 5 miles out in the lake to slow her down for a careful landing at her dock by the old pier Marquette Bridge. One day she came in too fast and hit the bridge and proceeded to smash the 2-foot square timbers like matches. We went down in her bow looking for leaks, but her network of reinforcements took the terrific jolt with ease. President of firm. William Hull was president of the company, a good-looking man with a dark complexion. He was of a deep mind and very few words. He had married a Twin Cities society belle whose name had long been attached to the St. Joseph River steamship lore, May Graham. She was a fine lady with a personality plus and bubbling over in friendliness to rich and poor alike. Ray Divis, former University of Michigan football star, was secretary of the line. He was the former coach of Benton Harbor's high school championship football team of 1908. That team included such well-known youths as Don Farnham, Bill Downey, Pat Crow, Leon Hill, Harry Joe Brown of Hollywood fame, Roy Montfort, John Morlock, Lester Null, and other Huskies. I might add for the history of the Orange and Black that this was the team that walloped Illini Bob Zupke's tough Muskegon 11-22-0. One bright October Saturday on the gridiron at Old Eastman Springs. Those were the days of the big all-wool tiger-striped football blankets. Those were the days of the famous Moro and stone shoes that called for a new soul with every victory, one over the other. Those were the days when they closed up the town and took the bounding old streetcar to Eastman Springs for the Orange and Black, added the scalp of all opponents, just like Grant took Richmond. Remember? Returning to my steamboat story, Clarence McCullen, Al Morford, Ted Stone, and myself made up the rest of the office and baggage force. Hans Pedersen was the captain of the ship with transatlantic experience behind him, and he carried out his duties with skillful mind and hand. Just like it was yesterday, I can see him, blonde and sunburned, Natalie dressed in white, squinting into the sun-dappled waters that daily awaited his gleaming ship. George Munger. George Munger was purser, and they asked me to go and be his assistant on Saturday's picnic trip to Michigan City. I have forgotten the reason for my excuse and good fortune, for the next morning while eating breakfast, James Dixon's mother called up and gave me the terrible news. Later, war hero. Martin Collins, the first local boy to give his life for his country in World War I, had charge of the concession and bar. This was his summer job while attending Northwestern University. The law forbid opening the bar until the ship was 3 miles from the shore, and this fact saved him. However, 2 years later, while serving in the Merchant Marine aboard the Florence H., the ship was hit entering the harbor of Brest in France, and Martin Collins died. Martin Collins and Harry Joe Brown, who both lived on the flats, were boyhood pals and inseparable, and many is the day these two youth held the floor in sport conversation at Pardon's popular cigar store. A ballroom perhaps 50 by 100 feet occupied the entire main deck of the Eastland in the bow, with a floor polished like glass. It was here on the fateful Saturday morning that 100 dancing couples never had a chance when, without warning, the Eastland tipped on her side and the 200 merrymakers slid, screaming into a helpless mass across the polished floor, and water gushed into the open portholes. Let's return to my place on the platform. Halfway up the bluff, as I looked down at the panorama below me that soon was to close for the day, there went the Eastland, out of the harbor, on her journey of no return. She was a beautiful ship, painted a dazzling white, and her 2 funnels were like those of a Holland American transatlantic liner. They were striped in gold. Between her masts were strung 100 pennants of every color and hue. She was decorated to match the light-hearted gaiety of her passengers bound for Chicago and home. From her stern gently waved Old Glory as she silently gained speed between the piers. From her funnels the billowing smoke was caught in the wind of her own creation. The setting sun and the lighthouse. the big blue water, and the shore of golden sand made a picture worthy of a place in any art gallery. To add to all this Caribbean luxury resemblance, a calliope on her top deck added to the frolicking joy of her departure. And I will never forget that popular song of long ago. Every night she sailed from St. Joe, her melodious circus music let forth with a whistling tune you could hear for miles, that popular refrain of 1915. Goodbye, everybody. And never did the Eastland come back to Old St. Joe, for the next morning the gigantic tragedy occurred, and the once proud and invincible Eastland, without warning, suddenly tipped on her side in the dirty waters of the Chicago River and carried over 800 carefree Western Electric employees, Michigan City bound for a picnic, to sudden death in the greatest marine disaster ever recorded in the history of the Great Lakes. End of article. Oh, and if you've never heard of a calliope, well, picture this. It's a steam-powered instrument that plays music through a row of whistles, kind of like a pipe organ on caffeine, if you want to think of it that way. In 1915, calliopes were often used on steamships and showboats, blasting out cheerful tunes that could be heard for miles. They were part of the spectacle, lighthearted, loud, and full of energy. But of course, in this story, that same joyful sound now feels eerily out of place. The song that Robert L. Brandt just mentioned in his article was called Goodbye, Everybody. And it was very popular in 1915, and it actually is a lighthearted number about a man saying goodbye to his many women friends before he gets married. But in this context, the title becomes something else entirely. It's chilling, it's ironic, and yet somehow it fits. It looks as if it was from a play called A Modern Eve, but the music was by Gene Gilbert and the lyrics were by William M. Howe. And I'll include a picture of the sheet music because the art itself is quite amazing. So take a listen.
Goodbye, dear old fellows, farewell, ladies gay. Goodbye, everybody, I got married today.
Again, you were just listening to, straight out of 1915, Goodbye, Everybody, a very popular piece that was played on the Eastland as it got ready to take off. The lyrics were by William M. Howe and the music was by Gene Gilbert. I do believe that this recording was made by Henry Burr on October 10th, 1912 for Columbia Records. However, there is another version that was recorded by Walter Van Brunt on June 20th, 1912. I'm not sure which person is singing here, but it's either one or the other. Well, thank you again for joining me on this adventure to Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, Michigan. I hope you enjoyed seeing yet another aspect of the Eastland through the stories of those who lived through this experience. I will talk to you next week. Take care of yourselves and each other. Goodbye for now. Hey, that's it for this episode, and thanks for coming along for the ride. Please subscribe or follow so you can keep up with all the episodes. And for more information, please go to my website. That's www.flowerintheriver.com. I hope you'll consider buying my book, available as audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardcover, because I still owe people money, and that's my running joke. But the one thing I'm serious about is that this podcast and my book are dedicated to the memory of all who experienced the Eastland disaster of 1915. Goodbye for now.